The war was supposed to end months ago. That's what every broadcast, every hopeful commander, every trembling politician kept telling us. But as the sky turned a permanent shade of ash and the horizon glowed with distant fire, everyone knew the truth humanity was losing, and losing badly. Some still tried to pretend otherwise, but most of us had reached the same quiet, terrifying realization. We were fighting an enemy that didn't fear us, didn't understand mercy, and didn't seem capable of stopping. Our cities had become shadows of themselves, empty shells where the wind carried the echo of things we used to take for granted. And in the middle of that collapse, a story began to spread. A rumor at first, a whisper, a last-chance idea that sounded almost desperate. Until it wasn't. Some said it started with an old research team stationed far from the main battle lines. Others claimed it came from deep within the archives, uncovered by accident after generations of being sealed away. But the truth? No one really knew. What mattered was the message. Humanity had once called upon something ancient beings older than any star we'd ever charted, and maybe, just maybe, we could call them again. It sounded impossible. It sounded reckless. And yet, when you're standing at the edge of extinction, even an impossible hope feels like oxygen. The person at the center of all this was a quiet scientist who never wanted fame or attention. They were someone who believed in symbols, in the idea that ancient didn't always mean gone. Their research was old history legends, carvings, fragments of stories passed down from civilizations that vanished before humanity learned how to build a fire properly. These stories spoke of towering guardians made of light and shadow, of watchers who drifted between worlds and only intervened when the balance of life was threatened. To most, it was mythology. To this scientist, it was a warning and maybe a promise. When the war reached its darkest point, Command finally listened. Not because they believed, but because they had nothing left to lose. Every defense line had collapsed. Every fleet was running low on power. Humanity's strongest weapons were barely slowing the enemy down anymore. And so the scientist was given access to everything: old ruins, encrypted archives, even locations that hadn't been touched since before the first space colonies were built. There, hidden under layers of dust and forgotten translations, they found instructions, a ritual, a signal. Not magic, but something that felt like it. No one expected it to work, not really. A small team was assembled, mostly volunteers, ordinary people who were tired of watching their world crumble. Engineers, linguists, a pilot with more scars than stories, and a communications expert who had lost nearly everyone but still showed up every single day because giving up felt worse than fighting. Together, they traveled to a distant place on the edge of human territory, a place where the ground pulsed with faint energy as if remembering something ancient. Setting up the signal took time, days of constant adjustments, nights of frustration. The team argued, laughed, broke down, encouraged each other, and kept going because stopping meant accepting defeat. And then, on a night when the air was unusually still, they activated the final sequence. The world didn't shake, the sky didn't tear open. There was no flash of power. Instead, the signal went out quietly, drifting into the void, calling out to beings that might not even exist. For hours, nothing happened. The team waited, trying not to look at the enemy forces gathering on the horizon. Command kept sending desperate updates. The final defensive walls were failing. The last fleet couldn't hold position much longer. If help didn't come soon, there wouldn't be anything left to save. And then, one by one, the stars began to dim. Not like they were fading, but like something massive was moving between them. A presence. A shape that made the air vibrate and the ground hum with low, steady rhythms. The team stepped outside, stunned into silence. Above them, space itself seemed to fold, revealing silhouettes that didn't match any species humanity had ever encountered. They weren't machines. They weren't ships. They were something else, something vast, something awake. For the first time in months, the enemy paused. Their ships drifted, unsure. And in that breath-holding moment, humanity realized the ancient beings had answered. But what they were about to do, and whether they came as protectors or judges, was something no one could predict. No one moved at first. The team just stood there, staring up at shapes so massive they seemed to swallow whole constellations. The air had a strange weight to it, like the atmosphere itself was holding its breath. The scientist, who had pushed for this moment more than anyone, suddenly looked unsure. They whispered something too soft to hear, maybe a prayer or maybe a final, "Please let this work." The rest of the team exchanged uneasy glances. No one knew whether they should feel relieved or terrified. Humanity had asked for help, but no one had stopped to think about what kind of help ancient beings might offer. Command kept sending messages asking for updates, but no one could even begin to explain what they were seeing. The communication expert tried to form a report, but every time they looked back at the sky, all words disappeared from their mind. The towering forms didn't move like ships. They drifted in slow, deliberate arcs, as if studying the battlefield from a place far above human fear. A soft hum rippled across the ground, and for a moment it felt like the world itself was syncing its heartbeat with theirs. But the enemy didn't wait. They never did. On the horizon, their front lines began to shift again, preparing to advance into what was left of human territory. Even from a distance, their movements created a faint tremor underfoot. The pilot muttered that they needed to fall back, but no one was listening. Everyone's eyes were still locked on the sky. The beings finally reacted. One shifted slightly and tiny sparks of light drifted down like glowing dust. They landed softly on the ground, floating just above the soil. When one drifted close to the scientist, it pulsed lightly, as if curious. They took a hesitant step forward, their voice shaking as they whispered, "We called you. You heard us." The light pulsed again, brighter this time, and a low vibration rolled through the air. It wasn't speech, not in any language humans knew. It felt more like emotion, old, slow, and impossible to fully grasp. The team felt their knees go weak, not from fear, but from an overwhelming sense that they were standing in front of something that had watched the universe grow up, something that had seen wars far greater than this one. And yet, they didn't strike, they didn't defend. They didn't even seem angry at the enemy closing in. They seemed to be waiting. The engineer finally broke the silence. "Do they want something from us?" they asked, almost whispering. "Maybe they won't help until we give them something. But what could humanity possibly offer beings older than the suns?" The scientists stepped closer to the hovering light and slowly reached out their hand. The moment their fingers brushed its glow, a jolt of images flashed through their mind rivers of stars, collapsing worlds and beings of shadow and flame fighting across empty space. They gasped and pulled back, trembling. The team rushed to steady them, asking what happened, but all the scientists could say was, "They've seen wars like this. Worse than this." "They don't choose sides quickly," the pilot cursed it under their breath. "We don't have time for them to make up their mind." And that was the truth. Human defenses were almost gone. Command kept sending updates, short, choppy messages filled with fear. Entire districts were falling. Families were evacuating on foot because transports were overloaded. Every minute without help meant thousands more lost. The beings shifted again, this time lowering slightly, casting long shimmering shadows across the barren ground. The light fragments around them began moving in patterns, circling, weaving, forming shapes that almost looked like symbols. The linguists knelt down, studying the movements. "This is communication," they said, "not words." "More like intention," they watched carefully, trying to interpret the slow rhythm of the lights. "I think they're asking why we called them." The team exchanged looks. Wasn't it obvious? Humanity was collapsing, they were losing the war, they were desperate. But maybe desperation wasn't enough? Maybe the ancient beings wanted to understand what humans valued, what they were fighting for. Maybe they needed a reason to intervene. The scientists steadied their voice. "Tell them the truth," they said. "Tell them everything." So the communications expert stepped forward, not sure if their voice would even matter. They spoke into the open air as though speaking to the entire sky. They talked about the hope humanity still had, even in the darkest days. They talked about the cities that once shone with life, about the families that refused to give up, about the people who still believed tomorrow could be better than today. Their voice shook. But they kept going, because if these beings truly needed a reason, humanity had to give them its best one. When they finished, the lights stopped moving. The beings grew still, almost too still. Then, slowly, their forms began to shift into clearer shapes, bright outlines that looked almost humanoid, but not quite. The temperature dropped, and the ground trembled ever so slightly. A low, echoing sound vibrated through the air, deep enough to rattle bone. The team stared, breath caught in their throats. The beings were finally responding. But whether they were answering the call for help or judging whether humanity deserved it, no one could yet tell. The air felt heavier than before, as if the atmosphere itself was waiting to see what the ancient beings would do. Their shapes became clearer, still impossible to fully understand, but no longer drifting like distant shadows. The ground pulsed with a soft rhythm, and each pulse sent a faint vibration through the team's boots. It wasn't threatening, just a reminder that these beings existed on a scale humanity couldn't comprehend. Even so, the enemy lines in the distance continued to move forward, their silent formation tightening like a noose. The team tried to focus, but the tension made their thoughts scatter. The engineer kept pacing in small circles, mumbling about energy readings that didn't match anything known. The linguist crouched beside the glowing symbols, sketching rough translations even as their hands shook. The pilot watched the horizon, tapping their fingers nervously against their leg. They weren't scared of flying into battle, but this felt different, like waiting for a storm big enough to swallow the sky. The scientists stepped forward again. "We need to understand their question," they said. "It isn't just why we called them. They want to know what we're willing to do," the communications expert frowned. "We already told them everything. Words may not be enough," the scientist replied softly. "These beings have seen countless civilizations. They've watched planets rise and fall. They won't help unless they believe we're worth saving." Just as the team tried to process that, a faint tremor rippled across the ground, different from the steady pulses of the ancient beings. This one was sharper, more urgent. The pilot's eyes narrowed. "That's not them. That's the enemy." A moment later, a deep rumble echoed in the distance. The enemy forces were testing the boundary again. Not attacking directly, just pushing forward in slow, deliberate steps. Psychological pressure. A warning. A reminder that humanity's time was almost up. The linguists stood, clutching their notes. "We need to show them something. Something meaningful. Something that proves we're not just asking for survival. We're asking for a future. But what could possibly communicate that?" Before anyone could answer, another shape appeared in the sky, smaller, human-made, and flickering with damage. A battered scout drone descended erratically, landing hard near the team. Sparks flicked from its side as it replayed a fragmented recording. Grainy images flashed. Families rushing through shelters. Volunteers forming last-line defenses, medics guiding children through smoke-filled corridors. Humanity wasn't just fighting to survive, it was fighting to protect each other. The team exchanged looks. This was real, honest, unfiltered. The communications expert hesitated only for a second before turning to the beings above. "This is us," they said. "Not soldiers, not leaders, just people trying to stay alive. Trying to help each other. If you need to understand us, understand this." The ancient beings didn't move, but the shimmering lights around them shifted color, the first sign of change since they arrived. The ground's pulse softened, deepening into a slower, more thoughtful rhythm, almost like they were absorbing the message. But the moment didn't last. A sharp streak of light crossed the sky, passing dangerously close to the team. The pilot shoved the linguist out of the way as the streak hit the ground several meters behind them, bursting into a bright flare. Nothing harmful, but clearly intentional. The enemy had seen the ancient beings too, and now they were testing their reaction. Another flare came, this one landing even closer. The team instinctively ducked. The engineer shouted something about them, trying to provoke a response. The scientists stared upward, their expression tightening. If the ancient beings think we've brought conflict to them, they might leave, and leaving would doom everything. The communications expert stepped forward boldly, almost recklessly, trying to draw the beings' attention away from the battlefield. They spoke again, not shouting but steady and firm. We didn't bring this war to you. We came because we ran out of time. If we fall, millions will fall with us. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the beings shifted once more. A soft, descending chime filled the air, a sound so gentle it didn't match their massive forms. The light symbols on the ground rearranged themselves, forming a new pattern. The linguists' eyes widened as they began to read what little they understood. They're asking, "What have we lost?" The question hit harder than expected. The scientists took a step forward. "We've lost our homes, our safety, our sense of peace," their voice dropped. "And we're close to losing everything else." The beings remained still, their glowing forms flickering slightly. They were close to deciding something that much was clear, but which direction their decision would fall. No one could tell. The pilot pointed toward the horizon. "The enemy's moving again," they said quietly. Indeed, the enemy formation was shifting, arcing in a slow, calculated path toward the ancient beings. Whether they were preparing an attack or just testing limits, it didn't matter. Either option could trigger something irreversible. The team stood frozen between two forces older and more powerful than anything they had ever imagined, one bent on destruction, the other silent and waiting. And with every passing heartbeat, the distance between them shrank. The ancient beings had heard humanity's call, but whether they would answer it with salvation or judgment remained terrifyingly unclear. The enemy force crept closer in a slow, coordinated wave, their dark shapes blotting out what little light remained on the horizon. Each step shook the ground just enough to remind the team how outmatched humanity really was. The ancient beings didn't move, didn't raise any form of defense, didn't react at all. They simply hovered there, monumental and quiet, as if waiting for the universe to breathe the next command. The tension in the air felt sharp enough to cut. The pilot clenched their jaw. If they get any closer, they'll provoke a direct confrontation. We need to do something now. But what could they do? The team was standing between two forces, both powerful in ways humanity had barely begun to understand. One had already pushed humanity to the edge of defeat. The other had the potential to reshape the entire conflict if they chose to act. The weight of that uncertainty pressed on every heartbeat. The scientist stepped forward again, staring up at the nearest ancient form. Its outline shimmered like a star seen through rippling water. "If they want to know what we've lost," they said quietly, "we need to show them what we still have." The engineer shook their head. "How? We can't exactly present them with a list." But the scientist was already moving. They walked toward the hovering light fragments still drifting near the ground. Their hands trembled, but their voice was steady. "They're testing us, not our strength, our intent." Before anyone could stop them, they reached for the glowing light again. The moment their fingers touched it, a shock of images burst through their mind, this time even stronger. Battles on distant worlds, civilizations reaching out for help and being turned away, others rising above conflict and earning the ancient beings' guidance. It wasn't judgment exactly, more like observation, a search for understanding. The scientist gasped and stumbled back, nearly falling. The communications expert caught them, steadying their shoulders. "What did you see?" The scientist swallowed hard. "They don't choose sides. They align themselves with purpose, with meaning. They want to know if we're fighting for more than survival." The pilot glanced at the enemy creeping closer. "We're about to run out of time to prove anything." As if echoing their words, a deep rumble shook the earth again, this time closer, louder. The enemy formation shifted into an aggressive stance. Even without visible weapons, the threat radiated from them like heat. It was clear they were preparing to test the ancient beings directly. The linguist stepped forward, panic flickering in their eyes. If the enemy attacks them and the beings think we led them into a trap, the thought didn't need finishing. The ancient beings could vanish. Or worse, they could react in a way humanity couldn't survive. A sudden crackle of static burst from the broken scout drone still lying nearby. It sputtered, then projected more footage, this time clearer. Volunteers guiding entire groups of people through collapsing shelters. Workers repairing broken generators just to give communities one more hour of power. Strangers shielding strangers from falling debris. Humanity wasn't perfect. It was frightened, but it was still fighting for each other. The engineer pointed at the projection. Show them this. All of it, loop it if you have to. The communications expert didn't hesitate. They angled the projection upward, letting the flickering images shine into the sky like a silent plea. The scenes danced across the air faces full of exhaustion, fear, hope, determination. People helping each other even when everything seemed lost. For the first time, one of the ancient beings lowered a little more, casting a sweeping beam of soft light over the projection. The light shimmered, scanning each image with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Another being shifted beside it, and the low, pulsing sound beneath the ground changed pitch. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't dismissive. It was curious, but the enemy noticed. They advanced faster. The pilot cursed under their breath. They think we're buying time, and maybe they were just not in the way the enemy assumed. The enemy's entire front line surged forward, closing the distance by half. The ground cracked. Dust lifted into the air. The warning was unmistakable now. An attack was seconds away. The team instinctively backed closer to each other, though they knew it wouldn't matter. If the enemy launched a full assault, nothing human would survive it. The choice, the future, the fate of everything now hung entirely on the ancient beings. The scientists looked up, voice trembling with urgency. "Please," they whispered. "We've done everything we can." Another light fragment drifted toward the communications expert. It hovered at eye level, pulsing in a steady rhythm. Not aggressive. Not drifting aimlessly, directed. The linguist stepped closer, studying it. It's asking something again. Something new. They focused on the rhythm, counting the pulses, analyzing the shifts of brightness. It's asking, what will we give? What will we risk? What will we stand for? Before they could interpret further, a sharp flash streaked across the horizon, the enemy's first real warning shot. It wasn't aimed at the team this time. It wasn't even aimed at the ancient beings. It hit the ground in front of them, carving a long glowing scar into the earth, a final ultimatum. The air vibrated with tension, thick and electric. The ancient beings finally began to move in unison, slowly, deliberately, gathering their massive silhouettes into a single aligned formation. The team froze. This was it. This was the moment everything would shift. But whether that shift would save humanity or end it remained terrifyingly unknown. The ancient beings aligned in the sky, their immense shapes forming a pattern the team had never seen before. It wasn't symmetrical, but it felt intentional, like a symbol carved across the stars. The ground vibrated harder now, not from the enemy, but from the beings themselves, beginning some kind of preparation. The team watched with a mix of hope and fear, each breath tighter than the last. They all sensed that the beings were finally making a decision. Yet none of them knew which way that decision would fall. The enemy force stopped advancing. They stood perfectly still, as if they too were watching, waiting. The sudden stillness made everything feel unnatural, as though the battlefield had turned into a single held breath. Even the wind stopped moving. But then something unexpected happened. The light fragments around the ancient beings flickered and dimmed. The linguist stiffened. "That's not right. That's not how they reacted before." The engineer ran a quick scan with their handheld device, and their eyes widened. "Energy drop, a massive one." "Something's interfering with them." Everyone looked up sharply. The beings were still in formation, but their light, once steady and hypnotic, began to waver in uneven pulses. The scientist's voice cracked. No, this is impossible. Nothing should be able to disrupt them." Before they could say more, a deep, resonating sound rolled across the sky, not from the ancient beings, but from somewhere behind the enemy forces. A new vibration, darker, heavier, like the grinding of mountains. The enemy formation shifted, parting just enough to reveal something rising from behind their lines. At first it looked like a shadow, then it grew larger and larger. The team instinctively stepped back. "What is that?" the pilot whispered. It wasn't one of the ancient beings, nor was it a ship. It was something massive, towering even higher than the enemy forces that had already dwarfed human scale. It moved with slow, deliberate purpose, its outline jagged and somehow unnatural. It felt wrong, like something that shouldn't exist. The enemy forces didn't react with fear. They seemed to welcome it, adjusting their formations to make room as though receiving a leader. The scientist stared, pale. I've seen this shape before. In the visions, not in detail, but the presence. The destruction around it, the communications expert swallowed. You're saying this thing is older than them? Not older, the scientist said quietly. Opposed, the realization hit everyone at once. The ancient beings weren't the only ancient force, and the enemy had called something too. The ground trembled again as the colossal figure fully emerged. Its surface wasn't smooth like the ancient beings, it rippled like liquid stone, dark and absorbing every flicker of light around it. It raised an arm slowly, and the air around it fractured with thin lines of distortion like cracks in glass. The engineer stumbled back. It's interfering with them, with the ancient beings. It's suppressing their energy. The beings' lights flickered again, dimming further. The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Humanity wasn't just standing between an unstoppable enemy and a silent ally, they were standing in the crossfire between two ancient powers with a history far older than any human war. The linguist pressed a hand to their forehead. If these two forces are enemies, then calling one might have drawn the other. The pilots shook their head in disbelief. So we didn't just call help, we triggered a cosmic confrontation? No one answered because none of them wanted to say yes out loud. The new giant force took a single step forward, and the shockwave nearly knocked the team off their feet. Stones rattled, dust exploded upward. Even the enemy troops braced themselves. The ancient beings dimmed again, this time sharply. The scientist's voice turned urgent. They're being weakened. If that thing suppresses them long enough, they won't be able to intervene at all. And then? The communications expert asked, though they already knew. Then humanity stands alone, the scientist said. Against both sides, a chill swept over the team. The colossal dark figure raised its head, and the sky above it twisted in spirals of shadow. It let out another deep, resonating growl, though it wasn't exactly sound. The vibration hit the team like a wave, making their bones ache. Then something even stranger happened. The enemy forces began to pulse with the same dark rhythm, their bodies absorbing energy from the giant figure. Their movements became sharper, faster, more coordinated. As if they were being enhanced, the linguist stepped back, shaking. They weren't fighting alone. They were waiting for this moment. The pilot lifted their weapon instinctively, even though it wouldn't matter. So we called our ancient beings, and the enemy called theirs. Another pulse surged from the dark giant, stronger than the last. The ancient beings flickered dangerously, their formation breaking just slightly. One dipped lower, struggling to stay aligned. The scientist looked at the team with trembling determination. We can't just stand here. If the ancient beings fall now, everything ends. We need to help them. The engineer stared at them. Help beings that can move suns? How? The scientist didn't blink. Not with force. With intention, with connection, they asked what we would give. What we would risk. The ground rumbled again as the dark giant prepared another pulse, this one strong enough to shake the sky itself. The ancient beings dimmed to their weakest glow yet. The team knew they had seconds to act, seconds before the balance tipped completely. But what they needed to do, what they needed to offer, what they needed to risk, none of them were sure. Yet the choice hung over them like the last breath before disaster. And the next pulse was already gathering. The dark giant drew in another pulse of energy, the air tightening around it like a storm pulling breath before the strike. The ancient beings hovered in their fading formation, their light so dim it looked ready to disappear. The team had only moments left to act, and none of them truly knew what to do. Every instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go, no shelter, no escape, no fallback plan. This was the point where humanity either rose or vanished. The scientists stepped forward first, placing a hand over their chest as if steadying their heartbeat. We have to answer their question, they said quietly. What we will give. What we will risk? The communications expert nodded slowly. We risk everything. But we need to show them, not just say it. The engineer glanced at the projection device still displaying scenes of humanity helping one another. The faces on the flickering screen were tired, frightened, determined. Not warriors, not perfect, Just people trying to survive together? They need more than images, the engineer whispered. They need a choice, and in that moment the scientist made theirs. They stepped directly under the nearest ancient being's faint light. Standing so close their silhouette blended with its glow. "If you need something from us," they said, voice trembling but clear, "take it. My strength, my memory, whatever helps you understand humanity. But do something before the darkness destroys everything." The light fragment nearest them pulsed once soft, hesitant. Then it drifted forward. The linguist lunged instinctively to stop the scientist, but the pilot held them back with a firm grip. "Let them," the pilot said quietly. "This is the choice." The fragment touched the scientist's forehead, and for a moment the world went still. The scientist's eyes widened, not in fear but in clarity, as if seeing something far beyond the battlefield. Light wrapped around them, lifting them gently off the ground. The rest of the team shielded their eyes as the ancient being's glow surged brighter. Breaking through the suppression of the dark giant, the enemy reacted instantly. The dark giant roared a low, grinding vibration that shook the ground and unleashed its accumulated pulse. A wave of shadow tore across the field, racing toward the ancient beings. But this time the beings held their ground. Their formation tightened, their light sharpened, and their glow shifted into something new, something steadier, stronger, unified. The scientist floated between them, suspended in a pillar of warm radiance that seemed to feed directly into the being's core. The shadow wave struck. The team braced, expecting the beings to flicker again, but instead the wave split in two, bending around the beings like water diverted by a stone. The pulse rushed past the team harmlessly, scattering into fading sparks. The ancient beings pulsed once an immense, rising tone that filled the sky. The dark giant staggered. The enemy forces wavered, their synchronized rhythm breaking as their source faltered. The team watched, stunned, as the ancient beings shifted position again. Their light expanded outward, surrounding the scientist, and then flowing across the battlefield in a sweeping arc. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't destruction. It was something gentler, like a barrier of clarity that dissolved the twisting shadows. The dark giant tried to gather another pulse, but the beings were already moving. Their light folded inward, then burst outward in a single wave of pure, steady brilliance. The giant froze. Its body flickered, cracking like stone under too much weight. Then it collapsed, not in a violent explosion, but like a shadow pulled back by the dawn. The dark ripples in the sky evaporated. The enemy forces staggered, their movements losing coordination. Without their guiding presence, they faltered, retreating in disarray. Relief washed over the team, though none dared celebrate yet. The light around the scientist lowered gently, lowering them back to the ground. They swayed, dizzy but alive. The communications expert caught them, whispering their name with a mix of relief and awe. "What happened?" The pilot asked, voice unsteady. The scientist took a shaky breath. "They didn't take anything from me," they said. "They showed me something. They showed me what they needed." The linguist leaned in. "What was it?" The scientist looked at the ancient beings, now glowing softly, peacefully. They needed a choice, a willing connection, not a sacrifice. Just trust. The ground stilled at last. The ancient beings gave one final pulse of warm light, a farewell or a promise before slowly rising higher into the sky. Their forms blurred, merging with the stars until only a faint shimmer remained. The team stood in silence, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. But just as they began to breathe easier, the engineer's device beeped, a new signal. A faint signature? From beneath the battlefield? The pilot frowned. "That's not enemy tech." "Is it?" The scientist's expression changed slowly, uneasily. "No," they said quietly. "It's older." The ground beneath them gave a soft, shifting tremor. The story wasn't over. Something else had just awakened. The roar of the storm faded slowly as the ancient being hovered above the broken field, its glow settling into a soft silver haze that wrapped around us like a calming breath. For a moment, I simply stood there, trying to understand that the worst was finally over. The enemy's machines lay scattered and silent across the horizon, their once endless march now reduced to stillness. The air felt different, lighter, yet heavy with everything we had survived. I glanced back at the others, watching them lift their heads for the first time without fear shadowing their faces. It was strange how quickly hope could return once you realized you were no longer running. But even with victory settling into the ground beneath our feet, the ancient being wasn't leaving right away. Its presence lingered, almost as if it wanted to make sure we understood that peace wasn't something handed over, it was something we had earned through every step, every choice, every risk. I felt that truth more deeply than anything else. After everything we had faced, it seemed impossible that the story was simply ending here, yet there was finally a sense of stillness. The long-fought war, the fear of losing our home, the desperate call for help across the stars. It all felt distant now, fading like echoes at the end of a long tunnel. As we walked back toward the ridge where our camp had once been, the sky slowly opened into a soft blend of gold and pale blue. It had been so long since I had paid attention to something as simple as the color of the sky. Along the way, the ancient being drifted beside us, leaving faint ripples of light trailing behind it. It didn't speak at first. It didn't need to. Its presence was gentle, patient, almost curious about how we carried ourselves now that the danger was gone. Finally, as we reached the crest of the ridge, it turned toward me with a calm, steady brightness. "Your world is safe," it said, its voice like a quiet wind brushing across stone. "But safety does not mean stillness. What comes next belongs to you." The words settled deep inside me. I realized the climax of our story wasn't just the final battle. It was this moment, the realization that life would continue, and that we had a responsibility to build something better than what had almost destroyed us. I thought about the people we had lost, the cities we would rebuild, and the lessons etched into the ground by every step of the struggle. The ancient being seemed to understand that weight, because it drifted closer and placed a soft shimmer of light into my hands. It looked like a small sphere, no bigger than a stone, but warm with quiet energy. "This will help you remember," it said. "Not the war, but the strength you found within it." Before I could ask what it meant, the sphere dissolved into a gentle spark that sank into my palms, leaving a faint warmth behind. I wasn't sure if it was a gift, a reminder, or simply a symbolic gesture, but it filled me with a calm I hadn't felt in years. The ancient being slowly lifted higher into the air, its form brightening again. The others gathered behind me, watching with quiet awe as the last remnants of its light spread out like shimmering wings. "Will we ever see you again?" someone asked quietly. The ancient being paused for a moment, as if considering the question. "Only if you call," it said. "But I hope you never need to." And with that, it drifted upward, becoming a narrow beam that pierced the clouds and vanished beyond the sky. The air settled again, still and peaceful, as if the world itself was taking its first deep breath after a long nightmare. We stood together watching the last flicker fade. None of us spoke for a long time. There was no need to. The war was over, our home was safe, and something inside each of us had changed forever. The sense of unity, the understanding of what we had survived, and the quiet promise of rebuilding, it all felt like the true ending of the story. Not dramatic, not explosive, but steady and real, the way healing usually is. As we headed back down the ridge, I felt the warmth in my palms again, subtle but clear. It reminded me of everything the ancient being had said. The future was ours now. Whatever challenges came next, we would face them not as survivors defined by fear, but as people who had learned the weight of hope and the power of standing together. And for the first time in a very long while, that felt like enough.